Good morning. How is everyone? That's good to hear. I want to start off first by thanking WISE for what has been just a fantastic 3 days, and for the WISE organizers. This has just been a great conference, and I'm just very privileged to be here and speaking on the last day. So I have a very simple task. I'm just going to hopefully set out a few concepts and frames for this conversation about beyond degrees. And my goal is really just to set up the conversation that's to follow, because I think the debate's going to be just a really terrific conversation. I'm going to do it 20 minutes in 3 parts. And the 3 parts are that I want to first start out with just some frames for around broader educational reform. And then I'm going to move into talking about a problem space. I want to frame the beyond degrees conversation as a problem space. And then I'll conclude by moving into defining a little bit of a solution space. So I'm going to go in 3 parts. So let's start with a little bit of the framing of the broader education space. I really think that any conversation about education today has to start with the phrase, we're living in a time of dramatic change. And just note that we're living in a time of dramatic change. And that's part of what's so amazing about, in fact, having this conference in Doha. If you just think about the amount of change that this city has undergone just in the last 40 years, and I don't know if you guys noticed the headlines of the newspaper when we first got here, that the population has almost doubled in just the last couple of years. And it's almost hard to imagine what this city's going to look like in 5 years. And that's the nature of the world we live in. And it's important to remember that when you think about our educational system, because our educational system was designed in a time of stasis. It was designed for permanence, and that's not the context in which we're living. And so it's important to understand when we talk about education and we talk about this moment of transformation, that we're actually working in a system that was designed for stasis, and we're living in a time of dramatic change. So that's point number 1 for our broader framing, which brings me to point number 2, and I'm going to go back to an old friend, which is to say when you're in a new period of time, and ours is defined by change, we need new paradigms. So paradigms are simply the concepts or the ways we think about the world. And John Dewey, this man on the screen, our famous educational theorist of the last century, and part of what made him so extraordinary was that Dewey could take the major debates of his time, and rather than dig into the grit of those debates, Dewey could understand those tensions, and he'd rise above them and take the best of the tensions of both sides and develop a new paradigm, a new way of thinking. And so as I go through this talk today, I kind of want to say to all of us that we've got to reach in for our inner John Dewey, because this is a time when we need new paradigms. As we think about moving and shifting our systems out of stasis into really responding to this time of dramatic change, we need to be thinking about new paradigms. So those are the 2 big contexts that I think we always have to remember when we're talking about what I think we all believe, and I've been hearing it through this conference for the last 3 days, that we've got a moment of real transformation going on, and we got to grab it. So now let me move into the conversation about degrees and beyond degrees, and I want to start with defining it as a problem space. And in doing that, let me first just talk about degrees. Do people recognize this degree? Harvard University? When defining a problem space, it's kind of easiest to take something really concrete, sometimes an extreme example, and this is a little bit of a gold standard, and to take it apart. So a degree is supposed to signify things. And so when I see this degree, I can come up with 3 things immediately that it signifies for me. The first thing that it signifies, and let's take Camille, it's the name on the degree. You look at this degree and you kind of think, okay, Camille probably did some things that were relatively extraordinary when she was 16, 17, 18, or her parents did, to ensure that she got admitted to Harvard. Second thing it signifies, probably between the ages of 18 to 22, which is usually when someone attends a school like Harvard, Camille worked pretty hard. And she probably learned some pretty core skills in academics and in some areas that we care about during those 4 years. Third thing that I think this degree signifies is that she has been judged by a set of folks that around the world, actually, we trust, that say that Camille was a part of an elite group, that at least during that 4-year period or 5-year period before she was accepted too, that usually there's 1,000 students that get admitted to Harvard every year, that she was a part of an elite 1,000 group cohort that got accepted. 3 big signifiers that often matter. So we'll do a little test. I have 2 degrees similar to this, not Harvard. I went to Yale, and I have a Stanford degree too. Those are well-known US universities. So as soon as you hear that, in a very personal way, you might look at a person and say, oh, a little bit of status, signifying all those things. And it might be a check on, does it signify that? The other thing it should signify, certainly true for me, is that Camille probably has debt. I was in debt for 12 years after I got my first degree, 3 times the number of years I was actually in the university. So there are 4 big signifiers of that kind of a degree. I want to go a little bit deeper, though, because as we talk about the problem set of degrees, which is to say that degrees have historically also been connectors. And I want to look at the ways in which they have served as connectors historically, because I think it's the erosion of these connections that really cause us to have this conversation today. So let's look at these a little bit more deeply. The first kind of connection that degrees have been meant to connect is the earner of that degree to a job. And this data is from the United States. It's hard to do jobs globally everywhere, but it's the trend. So in the United States, more than half of those with BAs are now unemployed. That's a bit of a problem, but it becomes even more of a problem when we understand that actually jobs are available, and that employers are saying that it's a talent shortage. There's some kind of a disconnect there. It's even more of a disconnect when we understand that the jobs that are hard to fill in skill areas that schools typically are responsible for providing those skills. Disconnect number 1. It leads us to disconnect number 2, which is that whether or not we like it, our accountability systems, and degrees are a big part of our accountability system, drive the learning experience within those institutions. And it's clear, and we've heard a lot about this throughout the WISE conference, that the kinds of experiences that are being offered in our institutions are not connecting with the kinds of experiences that our young people are looking for and that they need. And that in a time when we're leaving to our young people really complicated problems to solve, whether they're health issues, climate change, poverty, kind of global issues that we know our young people are going to have to solve. And in order to solve them, they're going to need to do the kind of learning that's deeply connected to their identity, that requires a kind of persistence and resilience, that requires the kind of creativity that we've been talking about for the last 3 days, kinds of communication and social skills, kinds of things that, as we've been talking about, we know are not taught within the academic subjects, and we know are not necessarily being taught within our universities right now. And they're not accounted for in our degrees. A disconnect. Third and last kind of disconnect that I want to bring up today. And I also want to say that this is not an extensive or exhaustive conversation. Remember, I'm just trying to highlight and illuminate things in an illustrative way for the conversation that's going to follow. Third kind of disconnect. Degrees have historically connected pathways for learners, right? So that they connect the institutions for learners so that learners know which institutions and where learning should happen and how to follow the pathway in order to open up opportunities. The first disconnect, which is jobs or other opportunities. This is the traditional pathway to opportunity. And there are degrees that are often earned at each step, whether it's from elementary school. In the United States, we have 8th grade graduation. High school, college, graduate school, career. Very linear progression. And some of the work that we've been funding at MacArthur, interestingly, we've begun to map people's learning. This is an example of someone's learning. The green are the jobs this person is holding, and I chose someone that we've been mapping who's more in the creative space because of the theme for this conversation. The green are the jobs that he's holding. In the 21st century, it turns out that young folks are beginning to hold multiple jobs at the same time, and this person does some consulting on the side as well as having a main job. And this is not an anti-school or anti-degree conversation. Clearly, the orange is school. He did the linear pathway. But look at the blue and the pink. Those are all the places that he's been learning outside of school that have had a huge impact on his career. It's almost too many to count. It's a networked approach to learning. And now think about the role of the degree in connecting all of those learning opportunities. And think about the richness, actually, of the ecosystem of his learning, and how little the degree actually represents or connects all of that. And how does he, as a learner, even make sense of all of the learning that has happened for him? And how does he even begin to represent all of that learning to anyone else? Does the degree really begin to help connect all of that? And so when we think about the tension or the problem set for degrees, I think the last two slides are the most important, because they're the difference between what the degree represents and what is now the lived experience of the learner. And I think that's where we have to dig in and begin to think about, when we think about the next iteration, the beyond degree conversation, I think, has to begin with what is now the lived experience of the learner. And so that's what I want to turn to next. And I want to offer, to take some of the lines from Graham's book, as we begin to reimagine learning and begin to think about new paradigms for learning in the context of dynamic change, how do we want to have this conversation about beyond degrees in a way that connects all of the learning that we just saw? And so I want to offer one possible solution set. And it's one that many of us, even in the room, have been working on. And I don't know if folks yesterday went to the badge workshop. That was really terrific. So Mozilla, folks at the Sprout Fund in Pittsburgh, DePaul University, University of California, many folks have been working on developing out what we call a badge infrastructure. So badges are digital icons. I'm just going to touch on what a badge is. That can represent learning, the learning that you've done. Because they're digital, they contain data. And that data can represent certainly all of the information that was signified on a degree, but it can contain much more, including the evidence of the things that you've done along your learning pathway. They can be encrypted, and they can be validated. They can be open and shareable. Folks have begun to work on it so that they are also going to be soon on mobile phones so that you can carry them with you. You can display them on all of the social networking sites and on the web in the variety of different places that one shows up. And most importantly for the conversation that we're having today, badges are really an attempt to enable credentialing wherever and whenever learning happens. So whether it's happening in school or what we call informal learning settings, whether it's an NGO, a nonprofit, a library, a museum, online, so that we can begin to make visible learning that's happening, both to the learner, him or herself, or to employers or to outside organizations. And then what we're working on now, not totally there yet with the technology and all the organizations, but we're getting there, is this idea that badges can be combinable and recombinable. Right? It's this technology word that we use called interoperable, so that we can begin to build pathways and networks so that the badges can represent kinds of learning that might be useful for jobs. They can represent pathways related to the learner's interests, or it could be a pathway that connects to an academic career, so that they are dynamic and have tremendous flexibility, so that it becomes, again, part of this conversation about living in a dynamic world that represents a much broader ecosystem of learning. And one of the things about pushing on paradigms, as we begin to push beyond the degree, as soon as we start opening up this conversation about, well, what if we start certifying and thinking about learning that happens beyond the school, and start thinking about badges, it immediately raises this question for us of what is the context for learning? Because the context for the degree is the school. But as I've just been describing the context for badges, it allows us to think much more broadly than the school. And so part of what we've been beginning to think about is, could the city be a broader context for learning than is the school? And it's not simply the question, we're not, again, this is not an anti-school conversation. It's that the city includes the school and beyond. So when you think about the map of learning that I showed, all of those resources exist within a city. In the United States right now, 80% of all youth live in a city. In 2015, that's going to be the statistic around the world. The majority of our resources and assets and adults for learning can be thought about in terms of a city. And we've been working on this in at least 4 cities in the United States. The Pittsburgh folks are here today, of really beginning to think about, if you badged all of the learning opportunities in a city, you could begin to make them accessible and transparent to all of the learners. So that the badges then, in the same way that a diploma used to align, the degree aligns all of the learning in a linear way, a badge can begin to align, coordinate, and make coherent all of the learning around a city, and connect that to jobs, connect that to academic outcomes, and connect it to the interests of the learner. And so we begin to have a little bit of a different paradigm for the learning ecosystem than we have historically had. One more paradigm that I want to talk about. Remember I said that the other function or signifier of the degree was that it sorted, that it gave you a sense of the eliteness of the Harvard diploma. Do you recognize what this is? The sorting hat. So in a time of dynamic change, when we don't know what the jobs of the next 5 years are going to be, I think it raises the question of whether or not sorting ought to be the real function of schools or of learning. Do we still need to sort young people through our accountability systems or through our degrees? I would argue that in the 21st century, and again, in a time of dynamic change, and I obviously can't say that enough, I'm not sure that we really need to sort anymore. I would argue that what we're looking for instead are ways to ensure that for all of our young people and for all of us, that learning is lifelong, and that learning becomes a lifestyle. And again, that as we think about this conversation about moving beyond degrees, that we really are thinking about systems and ways to constantly give feedback and to constantly push ourselves about the ways in which we can constantly update our own learning and constantly provide feedback about how we're doing, both to ourselves and to those around us. And that's part of why we've begun to really build on this question of badges and a badge ecosystem. And I want to end with one big point, which is to say that perhaps the most important part of the conversation for today is that we ask ourselves the tough questions, and that there's no one solution. I've offered one solution set to the question of beyond degrees, and that's really thinking about badges. It's thinking about cities as a place for learning. It's thinking about learning as lifelong instead of trying to find accountability systems that sort. That's only one possible solution set. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion that's going to follow, to really push us on the questions that we ask as we begin to frame what this new transformation for learning looks like in the 21st century, and that we push our own creativity in thinking about those questions. Thank you very much.